The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like wounded animals as Sarah Chen pushed through the ER doors at 11:13 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that had been washed so many times the fabric had taken on the texture of worn canvas. The graveyard shift at St. Michael's Hospital in Denver was her kingdom, for hours when the administrators went home, when the fluorescent glare softened into something almost human, when nobody watched too carefully what happened in the corners of the trauma bays. She moved through the hallways with the economical grace of someone who had learned efficiency in places where wasted motion meant wasted blood. The night nurse station smelled like stale coffee and something sharper underneath, the copper ghost of old bleach, the antiseptic that never quite covered the scent of what really happened in hospitals after dark. She clocked in without ceremony, her fingers steady as she logged into the system. They should have been shaking. Most people's hands trembled before a double shift, before 12 hours of charting and catheter changes and conversations with the dying. But Sarah's hands had memory older than this building, and fear didn't live in her anymore. It had burned out somewhere between Kandahar and the flight home. She smoothed the small folded flag in her left scrub pocket, the one nobody knew about, the one that never went through the hospital laundry. 14 by 8 centimeters, trifold, the kind they drape over caskets. Except this one had come from a different kind of funeral. Corporal Marcus Webb, 23 years old, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. She'd held him while his blood soaked through her field jacket in a forward operating base that didn't officially exist. She'd closed his eyes when the medics couldn't save him. And she'd folded his flag with the precision of someone trained in the liturgy of loss. That was 7 months ago. Now she wore scrubs and a name badge instead of body armor, and the folded flag pressed against her ribs like a question she didn't answer. The assignment had come through an encrypted channel 6 weeks before she got hired at St. Michael's. A voice she recognized but couldn't acknowledge gave her a location, a hospital, a date of employment. "We need eyes inside," the voice had said. No preamble, no justification. Just coordinates and a cover story. There was a patient coming to this hospital, someone with connections to a network they were tracking. Someone who might betray operational details, sell access, compromise people. The assignment was simple: get inside St. Michael's as a nurse, establish credibility, and report what you see. 18 months, maybe more. She'd done similar work in the military. This was just the civilian version, less shooting, more paperwork. She had no idea it would be Captain James Wheeler. The notification came through at 2:13 a.m. Sarah was in room for 12, changing the dressing on a post-op appendectomy, her hands moving through the motions with the rhythmic precision of ritual. The intercom crackled overhead, trauma activation. Gunshot wound to the thorax. Kandahar incident. ETA 8 minutes. Her hand stopped moving. Just for a fraction of a second. Long enough for muscle memory to override conscious thought, long enough for her breathing to shift from hospital normal to operational mode. 8 minutes. She finished securing the dressing, disposed of the old bandages, and walked to the trauma bay with the same measured pace she'd maintained for the last 3 months of her shift work at St. Michael's. The paramedics brought him in on a stretcher that looked too small for his frame. Captain James Wheeler, 34 years old, commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, Charlie Company, and the man her 16-year-old son David had called his best friend since basic training. She knew his voice. She'd heard him on video calls with David before the deployment, laughing about something stupid that happened during PT. She'd made David a care package once that Wheeler had helped pack, making sure the good cookies were on top so they wouldn't get crushed. Now he was grey as a corpse, blood streaming from an entry wound 2 inches below his left clavicle, his breathing shallow and wet-sounding. Sucking chest wound. She could see it from the door. Dr. Marcus Mercer was already there, tall and silver-haired in the way that meant he'd never screwed up badly enough to lose his position, moving through the trauma bay with the casual authority of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered. Mercer was the chief of emergency medicine at St. Michael's, well-connected, well-funded, the kind of doctor who'd attended medical school 20 years ago when the curriculum didn't include humility. He looked up from the vital signs monitor, saw Sarah approaching, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. The kind of look a man gives when he spots an inconvenience. "Not you," Mercer said, his voice cutting across the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Chen, you're off this case. Get to post-op and check on the hysterectomy in 406. Now." Sarah had learned 3 months ago that arguing with Mercer in front of his trauma team was a strategy that only worked if you had allies. She had none. She had a folded flag and a classified assignment and the kind of resume that couldn't be explained without federal charges. She nodded, turned, and left the trauma bay while they were still cutting off Wheeler's clothes, while they were still assessing the damage. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she recognized the doctor standing at Wheeler's head, the one who was beginning to intubate. Dr. Raymond Chen, no relation, though they shared the name, had been a trauma surgeon before going into administration at the VA system. He was the person Sarah was supposed to be monitoring. The reason she was here. She stood outside the trauma bay for exactly 6 seconds, her hand against the cold door frame, before her training took over and she walked toward post-op like she'd been ordered. The hysterectomy patient was stable, recovering well, her vital signs strong on the monitor. Sarah checked her lines, adjusted her blanket, and whispered something in Vietnamese, her mother's prayers, technically, though she'd added her own words to them over the years. Then she sat in the small supply room off post-op and pulled out her phone. The encrypted messaging app showed a single blinking cursor, waiting for input. She'd been trained to report twice weekly, always brief, always coded. But the face of the man bleeding in Trauma Bay 1 had changed the calculation. She typed, "Asset in facility. Unexpected. Compromised." The response came 30 seconds later, "Maintain position. Do not engage. Continue mission." Sarah pocketed her phone and returned to the night shift. Somewhere in the hospital, James Wheeler was fighting for his life while tubes were shoved down his throat and machines began the work of keeping his body tethered to its failing functions. Somewhere upstairs, the man Sarah was supposed to be watching was standing at his bedside, possibly monitoring the situation, possibly calling his contacts to assess exposure. And somewhere in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, Dr. Mercer had already made the calculation that Sarah Chen was a threat to the comfortable arrangement he'd been running for the last 4 years. She just didn't know it yet. But she would. The hospital was about to become a different kind of battlefield, and she'd already lost the cover that made her invisible. The night stretched forward. Sarah returned to her station, charted her patient updates, and moved through the hospital like water through a stone, present, necessary, completely unremarkable. She had 18 months left on her assignment. Maybe less now. She had no idea what Dr. Mercer was already planning. The Grand Rounds conference room at St. Michael's smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. 23 residents in white coats sat in tiered rows, their attention fixed on the projection screen where Sarah's medication log scrolled across in clinical white text. Dr. Mercer stood at the lectern with his hands clasped, the picture of concerned mentorship, while the attending physicians lined the back wall like judges at a tribunal. "What we're looking at here is a systemic failure in documentation protocol," Mercer said, his voice carrying the measured disappointment of a man explaining a child's poor report card. Nursing staff, especially those on the night shift, seem to believe that speed excuses accuracy. This is not a suggestion. It's the law. He clicked to the next slide. Sarah's shift notes from 3 weeks prior, highlighted in red. A morphine dose recorded at 2:14 a.m. A fentanyl push at 3:07 a.m. All documented. All correct. All exactly what the attending had ordered. Careless. Dangerous. The kind of negligence that creates liability for this institution. Mercer turned to face the tiered rows of residents. "When you advance to attending status, you'll be held responsible for the nurses under your supervision. This," he gestured to the screen, "is what failure looks like." Sarah stood at the side of the room in her scrubs, the folded flag pressing against her ribs like a weight. She could feel 23 pairs of eyes flicking toward her, then away. Discomfort. The second-hand shame of watching someone publicly eviscerated. The residents would go back to their rotations and not think about her again. That was how institutions worked. One person's destruction was everyone else's brief distraction. The interesting thing, Mercer continued, addressing the room but speaking loud enough for Sarah to hear every word, is that we can't find a pattern of error. It's almost as if she's compensating for something. A language barrier, perhaps. Cultural differences in how medical protocol is approached. He smiled, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. I'm sure Nurse Chen does her best. Some people simply aren't wired for precision in this environment. The slight emphasis on her name. The air quotes around best. A resident in the front row stifled a laugh that turned into a cough. Another scratched at her notebook with unnecessary force. Sarah's hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed even. The folded flag pressed harder, a reminder of what real scrutiny felt like. This was theater. Amateur hour. But Mercer didn't know that, and that was the only advantage she had. When the presentation finished, he smiled at her. Actually smiled. The smile of a man who had just dismantled someone in front of their peers and expected gratitude for doing it constructively. Thank you for allowing us to use your documentation as a teaching moment, Nurse Chen. It benefits everyone to see where standards slip. Of course, Doctor, Sarah said. Her voice was steady. Deferential. The words of someone learning to navigate a system that was stacked against her. I appreciate the feedback. The lie tasted like copper. She turned and walked out of the conference room before he could respond, before anyone could see what her face was doing. The hallway outside was empty. Her heart rate sat at baseline. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. From knowing that power held by men like Mercer was temporary, earned from proximity to systems rather than competence. She could wait. She was good at waiting. 20 minutes later, Captain James Wheeler's monitors began to spike. The cardiac rhythm on his central line was deteriorating, subtle at first, the kind of change that a nurse watching closely would catch before any alarm sounded. Sarah noticed it while checking the medication pump. She looked at the EKG strip. Ran the numbers in her head. She should report it. Follow protocol. Find an attending. Instead, she went to his bedside and checked his dressing. Still dry. Lungs clear on auscultation. But something was wrong. The kind of wrong that wasn't medical, but political. She could feel it the way soldiers could feel an ambush before it happened, a shift in air pressure that meant someone was about to make a move. She was leaving his room when she heard Mercer's voice in the hallway. He was on his phone, speaking low enough that the words didn't carry. But the tone did. Authority. A man calling in favors. Sarah made it to the break room and pulled a cup from the cabinet. The vending machine hummed its mechanical rhythm, a sound like a generator in a FOB mess tent, 7,000 miles away. She fed in $2 bills and pressed the button for black coffee. The machine wheezed and dispensed, the cup dropping with a plastic clink. She was turning back to the counter when she heard them. 2 residents, their white coats still pristine from this morning's presentation. They were standing 3 feet away, heads bent together, speaking in whispers that weren't whispers at all. I appreciate the feedback, Nurse Chen, one of them said, mimicking her slight accent at the Pacific Northwest flatness that came from growing up in military families, from spending more of her life outside the country than inside it. Some people simply aren't wired for precision. The second resident laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that meant they weren't being cruel, just thoughtless. Just following the social permission that Mercer had given them an hour ago. Sarah didn't move. Didn't turn around. She poured cream into her coffee with the same deliberate precision she'd use in surgery. One hand steady. The small movements of someone who had learned that reaction was reaction, and reaction was weakness. She could see their reflection in the break room window. They were watching to see if she'd noticed. Testing the boundaries. Waiting for her to either cry or get defensive, either of which would validate their mockery as justified. She turned to face them. looked at each one for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough that they knew she'd heard. Long enough that the joke curdled into something else, the beginning of fear. Then she walked past them like they didn't exist. 30 seconds. That's how long it took for the humor to drain from their faces and turn into something closer to shame. By the time she reached the hallway, she heard one of them say, "God, that was mean." Sarah didn't care. Mean was irrelevant. Mercer had given them permission. Mercer was the real problem, and Mercer was watching from his office door as she walked past, his expression satisfied. He'd seen the mockery. He approved. That was all he needed for the rest of the staff to understand that Sarah Chen was small enough to pick at, and Dr. Mercer was untouchable enough to encourage it. She went back to the floor. Wheeler's monitor was still showing subtle dysrhythmia. She documented it. Wrote up her observations. Sent the note to the attending on call, a good doctor, careful, someone who would actually read the data. But when she approached Wheeler's room an hour later, there was Mercer blocking the doorway. His arms were crossed. His voice was light, conversational, the way someone spoke when they held all the cards. "I don't think we need another set of hands in this room, Nurse Chen." Sarah stopped 2 feet from the door. "The patient's rhythms are irregular. I need to check his lines. The day shift will handle it. Consider yourself reassigned to the East Wing." He smiled again. The same smile. "I need someone more focused on standard protocols in this bay." She could feel the weight of his authority pressing down. Could see how he'd constructed this, gotten her name removed from the assignment list, arranged for her to be somewhere else, made it seem like a routine decision rather than a punishment. This was the competence she'd been waiting for. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the smooth operation of institutional power. "I understand, Doctor," Sarah said. "Good. Now, step back." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind that expected immediate compliance, the kind that assumed she was someone who complied. She stepped back. Let him close the door. Let him think he'd won. But as he turned to walk down the hallway, Sarah spoke. Her voice was level. Almost conversational. A statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone who had nothing left to lose. The interesting thing about men who talk this much is they're usually compensating for something they can't do. Mercer stopped. His shoulders tensed. He turned back to face her, his expression shifting from satisfaction to something sharper. His mouth opened to respond, but Sarah was already walking away. Not running. Not retreating. Walking with the measured pace of someone who had said what needed saying and had no interest in his answer. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. She could feel his rage like heat off summer asphalt, all the hotter because it was directed at someone who wasn't supposed to talk back to him. Someone who was supposed to accept his authority without question. Someone who was supposed to be broken by grand rounds and vending machine mockery and the weight of institutional power. But Sarah Chen wasn't someone. She was a captain who had held bleeding soldiers and kept moving. Who had written casualty reports and never cried. Who had learned long ago that the only power anyone could take from you was the power you agreed to give them. The next words he tried to speak were drowned out by the intercom. A voice crackled through the overhead system, professional, urgent, the kind of alert that made every head on the floor turn. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 1. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 1. Sarah heard the announcement, and something in her chest shifted. That familiar pressure. The kind that meant she needed to move. To be useful. To stop being the humiliated night nurse and start being something else entirely. She was halfway to Trauma Bay 1 when the doors burst open and they came through, 2 soldiers in civilian clothes, but moving with the discipline of active duty. One was carrying a third, whose left shoulder was a dark bloom of crimson that had soaked through his shirt. The third's eyes were rolling back. His breathing was shallow. He was dying, and the 2 soldiers carrying him knew it with the kind of certainty that came from having watched people die before. "We called ahead," the first soldier said, his voice clipped. The accent was pure Georgia. The uniform under his civilian shirt was 82nd Airborne. Major Hutchins. GSW to the left anterior chest. We pulled him from an active situation 15 minutes ago. He's crashed twice since we left the scene. Mercer was already in the bay. So was the attending on day shift, Dr. Sarah Rosen, who was competent in the way that mattered when bodies showed up with holes in them. The ER nurses moved with the synchronized precision of a choreography done 100 times before. Trauma shears. Central lines. The rhythmic hiss of oxygen. But something was wrong with the setup. The chest tube placement was going to miss. Sarah could see it in the angle, in the way Mercer was holding the needle, in the micro movements that betrayed someone who had learned procedure from a textbook rather than from a body. From 7,000 miles away. The needle would catch rib instead of hitting the pleural space. Would do nothing to re-expand the collapsed lung. Pain is data. Pain tells you things. A gunshot wound to the anterior chest cavity usually meant a pneumothorax. Air in the space between lung and rib cage. Pressure building. The lung collapsing like a fist clenching. The heart shifting. The vessels kinking. The machine showing what the body already knew, that this man was dying because he couldn't breathe, because every breath pulled him closer to death. Sarah moved without thinking. Her hands knew the angle. Knew the depth. Knew exactly where the needle needed to go, just above the second rib, in the midclavicular line, quick and confident before the vessel pressure difference sucked air in through a tunnel and made the problem worse. Mercer was still fumbling with his placement. Second intercostal space, Sarah said quietly. Midclavicular line. He needs it now. Mercer turned to face her. His expression was already building toward something hot and angry. I'm managing this patient. You. Out of position, Sarah finished. The angle's off by 40 degrees. He's dropping into profound shock. You have maybe 90 seconds. The monitor was screaming. The heart rate had crept up to 142. The blood pressure was a ghost, barely registering. The oxygen saturation was plummeting. 78, 72. 66. Mercer didn't move. Didn't pivot. Didn't correct his approach. He was frozen by the weight of being told he was wrong, in public, by the woman he'd just humiliated in front of 23 residents. Dr. Rosen, the actual attending, saw what Sarah saw. Saw the calculation that needed to happen in the next 10 seconds. She stepped forward and gently but firmly moved Mercer aside. Thank you, doctor. I've got this. She took the needle. Moved to the correct position. One smooth motion, the kind that comes from having done it more times than she could count. The needle slid in. There was a brief moment of pressure, then the hiss. The hiss of air escaping. The lung expanding. The pressure dropping. The monitor scream becoming a rhythm again. Sinus rhythm, the ER nurse said. Her eyes met Sarah's for just a moment. Recognition. The kind that passed between people who knew how to work under fire. The blood pressure climbed. 70 over 40. 80 over 45. Climbing toward something that looked like life. Mercer had stepped back. His face was still wearing the shape of his anger, but it was cooling now, turning into something harder to read. Something like calculation. Major Hutchins was still dying, but he was dying slower now. Still a chance. Still something to fight for. Still a patient who might see dawn. And Sarah, standing at the edge of the bay in her scrubs with the folded flag pressing against her ribs, had just revealed something that should have stayed hidden. She'd moved like someone who knew exactly what to do. Like someone who'd done this before. Like someone who was far more than a night nurse with documentation problems and an accent that made people laugh. The intercom crackled again. But this time it wasn't an alert. It was something else. Something that made the world tilt. Dr. Mercer, you have a call holding on line 3. It's the hospital administrator. She says it's urgent. And that's when the real nightmare began. The call came through at 2:08 a.m. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Captain Wheeler's monitor had flatlined, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had pulled a switch. Sarah was checking vitals 3 rooms down when the overhead crackled and every muscle in her body went rigid. The night shift skeleton crew moved like exhausted ghosts, but she moved like someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment for 72 hours. She was in the bay before anyone could finish pushing the crash cart. The surgeon was 20 minutes out, maybe 25 if traffic was against him. The clock had already started. Step back. Her voice dropped half an octave. It wasn't a request. The resident froze mid-compression, his hand still on Wheeler's ribs, his technique sloppy, panicked, all shoulders, no rhythm, the kind of desperate thrashing that broke ribs but didn't move blood. Sarah positioned herself at the head of the bed, hands already reaching for the defibrillator pads. You're compressing wrong. Midline. Perpendicular. Now. Nobody argued. Something in her voice made argument impossible. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Wheeler's chest wasn't moving air. The ET tube sat crooked in his airway. The resident had intubated him but hadn't secured it properly. Centimeters. That's all it took. Sarah tilted his head back, repositioned the tube with a kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her nurse's license, older than Denver, older than anything in this climate-controlled hospital. Her hands moved on their own. Tape. Secure. Check placement. The capnograph turned from purple to yellow. Air was moving. BP 72/41 and dropping. The tech's voice wavered. Push 0.5 mg epi. Sarah was already running the calculation. Wheeler weighed 190, maybe 195. Dosing was 0.1 mg per kilogram, for push, every 3 to 5 minutes. The resident stared at her like she'd spoken Pashto. Now. The medication. Push it now. He moved. They all moved. The machine had a new pilot. The defibrillator pads went on, one below the right clavicle, one mid-axillary line. Charging. Shocking. The body arched. Nothing. The monitor flatlined again, that terrible electronic silence that meant blood wasn't moving, oxygen wasn't reaching, the brain was dying 1 second at a time. Sarah's jaw clenched. Not here. Not Wheeler. Not with Mercer watching through the observation window like a vulture waiting for the kill. She hadn't noticed him arrive, but of course he'd come. Disaster brought administration like sharks smelled blood. Chest compressions resumed. She counted cadence in her head, 100 beats per minute, perfect timing, pressure deep enough to move blood but not so deep it fractured the sternum. The resident was doing better now, watching her, matching her rhythm like they were breathing the same air. Another round of compressions. Another round of medication. O2 sat climbing slowly. 63. 68. The numbers crawled upward like they were climbing from hell itself. Still no rhythm. The tech glanced at Sarah. Continue compressions. 2 more rounds. Her hands were steady on the medication cart, drawing up another dose of epinephrine from the crash box. The plastic vial clicked against the fall line. Push. The plunger went down like a prayer, like a command, like muscle memory from a field hospital in Kandahar where she'd stood over a kid from Bravo Company and done the exact same thing while mortar fire painted the sky orange. The kid had made it. Had walked out of theater 6 months later. Wheeler was going to make it too. O2 climbed. 71. 76. The monitor was still chaotic but something was there, some faint electrical activity, a signal that meant Wheeler's heart was remembering how to work. Sarah's vision tunneled the way it always did in crisis. The entire world became Wheeler's chest, the monitors, the medications, the ticking clock, nothing else. Not Mercer. Not St. Michael's. Not the accusation hanging over her like a blade. Just survival. Just the work. Epi again. She was still speaking in short declaratives, each word a command. Full dose. Push. The medication went in. Another round of compressions. The resident was sweating, his shirt soaked through, but his hands were steady now because he was following someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The monitor began to show something more organized. The electrical chaos was starting to look like actual rhythm. 82. 85. The numbers climbed. Each tick of the O2 sat was a heartbeat borrowed back from the edge. Sarah could feel it now, that moment when the body remembered it wanted to live, when the medication finally saturated the receptors and the damaged heart muscle began to fire in something resembling sequence. We have a rhythm. The tech's voice climbed half an octave in relief. Keep going. Sarah was already 3 steps ahead, already thinking about where Wheeler needed to go. The ICU, not a regular bed, monitoring equipment, probably an echocardiogram to assess damage. The wound from the gunshot was in the right upper quadrant, had probably nicked the RV or the pulmonary artery when he coded. The bleed was internal, massive. Blood loss calculated in seconds, not minutes. 90. 92. Stable. Not perfect, but alive. The automatic doors to the trauma bay hissed open. The on-call surgeon, Marcus Hayes, competent and exhausted and arriving exactly 23 minutes after the code started. He took one look at the monitors, one look at Wheeler's chest, one look at Sarah standing with her hand still elevated in sterile position, and his expression shifted. Recognition. Not of her rank, not of her name, but of competence. Of command. Of someone who'd done this before under circumstances that didn't include the luxury of hospital equipment. Status, he said to Sarah, not the resident. 20 minutes of resuscitation. Responded to epi at round 3. Current rhythm sinus tach at 108. BP holding at 92/58. O2 sat 92% on full vent settings. Pupils equal and reactive. Gunshot wound, right upper quadrant, probable RV involvement, significant internal hemorrhage. The words came out in the vocabulary of someone who'd written casualty reports, not nurses' notes. Military terminology. Triage protocol language. Sarah caught the resident staring at her like she'd suddenly developed a second head. Hayes didn't ask. He was already moving. Get him to OR. Now. Full surgical team. I want CT and bedside ultrasound before we open him up. Sarah stepped back from the bed. Wheeler's color was better already, oxygen doing its work, blood pressure holding, the electricity in his heart settling into something that wouldn't kill him. The team moved him onto the surgical stretcher in practice motions, already hooking portable monitors, already calling the surgical suite. Hayes paused for 1 second and looked directly at Sarah. You kept him alive. She nodded. Said nothing. Her hand smelled like betadine and adrenaline and something else, that acrid copper smell of blood that never fully washed out of scrubs no matter how many times the hospital laundry ran them through. The fight-or-flight chemicals were already draining from her system, leaving her hollow, exhausted, focused on one singular task now. To disappear before Mercer could make this worse. The laundry room at St. Michael's was in the basement, 3 corridors past the morgue. The fluorescent lights down there hummed at a different frequency, more irritating, like they'd been installed during the Reagan administration and nobody had thought to replace them. Sarah carried her scrubs folded in a neat bundle, the surgical greens from the code, still damp with sweat and betadine. She stood in front of the industrial washer and unfolded them carefully, separating the top from the bottoms, removing the latex gloves that were still in her pocket. That's when she found the folded flag. She'd forgotten it was there. The small American flag from Kandahar, the one her teammate Martinez had carried, the one Sarah had recovered from his helmet after the IED. It was still in her scrub pocket, saturated now with hospital antiseptic and Wheeler's blood, the red dye running slightly into the white stripes. She held it under the cold water tap, rinsing it carefully, watching the contamination run down the drain. Her hands moved with parade ground precision, folding it back into its original thirds, then into a triangle, the way ceremonies demanded. Perfect. Military-grade precise. The way nothing at St. Michael's was precise anymore. The voice came from the doorway before she could put it in her locker. Captain Chen. That's an interesting way to do laundry. Sarah turned. Standing in the doorway was a man in an FBI jacket, charcoal gray, professional, the kind of expression that meant bad news had already been decided before he opened his mouth. Behind him, 2 hospital administrators in suits that cost more than her annual salary. Your employment at St. Michael's Hospital is terminated, effective immediately, the older one said. For gross violation of scope of practice. Unauthorized medical procedures. Administration of medications outside your certification level. And he glanced at a folder in his hands for impersonation of medical staff. Sarah looked at the flag in her hands. Still dripping. Still faintly discolored with Wheeler's blood. She said nothing. Dr. Mercer filed a detailed complaint with the State Nursing Board. We've also contacted your previous employment references at Walter Reed. They seem to have some questions about your background. The administrator's tone had shifted now, become accusatory. Your credentials appear to be fraudulent. We'll be forwarding this to law enforcement. The FBI agent pulled out a card. We'll need you to come downtown for questioning. Sarah set the flag on the laundry table very carefully. She folded her scrubs one more time with hands that didn't shake, that didn't tremble, that did exactly what they were trained to do. The betadine smell clung to everything, to her skin, to her clothes, to the small flag that had survived Kandahar and now carried the stain of the man she'd just saved. She looked at the FBI agent and the administrators and the crushing weight of institutional machinery that was about to erase her. And she smiled. Just slightly. The smile of someone who understood that Dr. Mercer had just activated every single alarm bell connected to her real assignment. I need to make a phone call, she said quietly. After that, I'll go wherever you need me to go. The agents exchanged glances. The older administrator cleared his throat. Well, you have the right to. But Sarah was already walking toward the corridor, already pulling out her phone, already dialing the number that wasn't in any phone book, the Pentagon direct line she'd memorized on day 1, the same encrypted number that had sent her to St. Michael's in the first place. The line clicked 3 times. Static. Then a voice that had nothing to do with hospitals or Denver or civilian life at all. Angel 6, she said when they answered. The cover's blown. I need extraction. Behind her, the administrators stared. The FBI agent reached for his phone. And Sarah stood in the basement of St. Michael's Hospital, holding a blood-stained flag from a fallen teammate, knowing that everything she'd built in the last 6 months was about to burn to the ground, and that the real reckoning had only just begun. By 6:22 a.m., the hospital corridors were already buzzing with whispered conversations that didn't include her name. Dr. Mercer had moved fast. The night shift had ended, but the damage was accelerating. Sarah knew what was happening because she'd seen it before in Kandahar. When an operation went sideways, command moved to contain the blast radius before it spread. Except this time, she was the blast. The first call came from the State Nursing Board investigator at 7:13 a.m. A woman with a clipped voice and 0 patience. Anonymous complaints had been filed regarding unauthorized medical procedures, scope of practice violations, and questions about Sarah's credentials. Had Sarah ever worked at Walter Reed? What was her employment status there? Could they verify her references? The questions came rapid-fire, professional, and designed to sound routine while carrying the weight of a hammer. Sarah answered each one with precision. Yes, Walter Reed. Discharged in good standing. References available. She didn't mention the classification level of those references or the fact that good standing meant something very different in military medicine than it did in civilian hospital bureaucracy. The investigator promised to follow up. By 8:16 a.m., Dr. Mercer was already moving his pieces. A board member called the hospital administrator. Then another. Anonymous reports, 3 of them citing patient safety concerns about an unstable night nurse who'd performed procedures outside her scope, who'd been insubordinate to attending physicians, who'd been involved in questionable medical decisions that had somehow resulted in a patient's stabilization that didn't match the clinical timeline. How was that possible without an authorized intervention? The insinuation hung in the air like blood in water. Sarah wasn't in the staff meeting where this was discussed, but she didn't need to be. The machinery was grinding. She could feel it. She could see it in the way the charge nurse avoided her eyes when she passed the station, the way residents suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere when she appeared. The second call came from someone claiming to be checking her references at Walter Reed at 9:51 a.m. But the voice on the other end wasn't standard HR protocol. This was someone who'd been given specific questions to ask. Specific implications to leave dangling. Had Sarah ever been reprimanded for unauthorized field procedures? Had there ever been questions about the authenticity of her service record? Had she ever served under a different name or designation? The caller didn't even bother pretending the investigation was routine. This was a hit job with institutional backing. Sarah answered what she could answer. The rest, she let hang. What she understood in those moments was that Dr. Mercer hadn't just filed complaints. He'd activated a network. He'd made calls to people who owed him favors or shared his interest in making her disappear. This was competent, strategic destruction. Not rage. Not incompetence. This was a man who understood institutional power and how to weaponize it. He was using her own hidden identity as the weapon, raising just enough questions about her past to make her credentials radioactive without ever directly accusing her of lying. Brilliant. Lethal. Exactly what she would have done in his position. By 10:38 a.m., the hospital administrator requested her presence in his office. Not a conversation. Not a discussion. Sarah walked down the basement corridor and climbed the stairs with the careful neutrality of someone who'd already accepted the outcome. The administrator was a man named Chen, no relation, though the coincidence had never escaped her attention. He sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled and his face arranged in the kind of sympathy that meant finality. "We've received concerning reports about your practice," he said. "Combined with questions about the authenticity of your credentials and military service, I'm afraid we can't continue your employment." It wasn't a request. It was a command, Sarah said quietly. "When?" "Immediately. You'll need to return your badge and clear your personal items from your locker. Security will escort you out." She didn't ask for details. She didn't argue. She didn't even ask if there was an appeal process. This was the moment she'd been training for her entire career, the moment when everything burned and you continued breathing anyway. She nodded once and stood. "You understand this goes on your record," the administrator added, as if that mattered anymore. "I understand." The walk to her locker felt longer than it should have. The basement of St. Michael's smelled like antiseptic and industrial detergent. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly pale glow. She passed the laundry room where clean sheets were being folded by a woman named Marcus who always smiled at her. She didn't smile back this time. That would have been cruel, false comfort. Her locker was small. She'd kept it that way deliberately. A change of clothes, a protein bar, a picture of David from his high school graduation. The folded flag from Kandahar, pressed into the corner behind her backup stethoscope. That was everything that mattered. She pulled it out and held it for a moment, the weight of it familiar in her palm. 18 months of work. 18 months of embedded surveillance inside St. Michael's, watching for the operative she'd been sent to monitor, documenting the patterns no one else had noticed. And Captain James Wheeler, David's commanding officer, the man she'd saved with her own hands at 2:11 a.m., had been the breakthrough. She'd finally confirmed his identity, his connection to the network they were tracking. The classified assignment had been weeks away from completion. And now it was gone. Burned to ash because a man with a wounded ego and access to a phone had decided she was a bigger threat than whoever she'd been hunting. She returned to the laundry room. The machines hummed their familiar industrial rhythm. The smell of bleach and hot fabric made her think of the field hospitals in Kandahar province, where blood-soaked uniforms were washed in basins and hung to dry in the dust. She found an empty folding table and laid out her scrubs, the ones she'd worn through a dozen night shifts, the ones that had been stained with Captain Wheeler's blood 12 hours ago. Muscle memory took over. She folded them with parade ground precision. Corners sharp. Creases perfect. Each movement deliberate and measured, the kind of discipline that soldiers learn because it was the only thing that kept you sane when everything else was falling apart. The fabric was still damp in places. She could smell the betadine from the emergency thoracotomy, the copper salt smell of blood that soap and water hadn't quite erased. A woman came in, one of the hospital volunteers, older, with kind eyes that had seen 40 years of this work. She didn't say anything. She just watched Sarah fold, and something in her expression suggested she understood the weight of those movements. "You can go home now," the woman said quietly. Sarah didn't respond. She folded the last scrub and placed it on the stack. She held the folded flag in both hands, looking at it the way a soldier looks at a weapon after the war is over. She'd carried this since Kandahar. She'd held it when her teammate died in her arms. She'd pressed it against her ribs under her scrubs for 18 months while she pretended to be someone else. And now it was the only thing that was actually hers. For a moment, just a moment, she thought about throwing it away. About walking out of St. Michael's and never looking back. About becoming someone completely new, someone without history or classification codes or a mission that had just evaporated into institutional politics. She could be just a nurse again. Just Sarah. No code name. No shadow box full of medals. No son waiting for her to come home alive. No. A sound cut through her thoughts. Distant at first. Then growing louder. The unmistakable rhythm of helicopter rotors, cutting through the Denver morning like a knife through silk. The sound was coming closer. It was coming directly toward St. Michael's Hospital. She looked up from the folded flag. The volunteer was already moving toward the window. "That's not a medical transport," the woman said. Sarah's hands went very still. The rotors grew louder, the sound so close now that it vibrated through the basement walls, through the metal tables, through her bones. She'd heard that sound before. She knew what it meant. She knew the difference between a standard hospital helicopter and the specific acoustic signature of a military Black Hawk in tactical approach mode. She knew she had no idea what was about to happen next. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a physical force, and Sarah knew. Not hope. Knew. The acoustic signature of an MH-60M Black Hawk didn't leave room for guessing. She was still holding her folded scrubs when the tactical insertion team rappelled down in full kit, body armor, weapons, the unmistakable patches of JSOC on their shoulders. 16 soldiers on a hospital ground. This wasn't a rescue. This was a retrieval. The phone in her locker had been silent for 14 months. The Pentagon direct line. Classified. Now it was ringing. In the St. Michael's conference room, Dr. Mercer was in the middle of his speech about professional boundaries when the first soldier in full tactical gear walked past the glass partition. Mercer didn't notice. He was too busy explaining why nurses needed to understand the chain of command, why certain people thought they could override protocol when the conference room doors burst open. David Chen stood in the doorway. 16 years old. Uniform pressed razor sharp. And he was holding a shadow box. Sarah heard her son's voice before she saw him. "Mom, they need to see these." The medical staff froze. The nurses looked at each other. Mercer's face went the color of old concrete. Inside the shadow box, a bronze star. A silver star. 2 purple hearts with oak leaf clusters. And pinned at the top, a Navy Cross with its pale blue ribbon, the second highest award for valor in combat. Captain James Wheeler rolled himself into the conference room despite the chest tube still sutured into his ribs. He demanded to be there. The medical team had argued. He'd overruled them with the kind of authority that only came from having trained 200 soldiers to trust him with their lives. Wheeler looked across the room at the shadow box. Then directly at Sarah. His voice was a whisper, but in the frozen silence of St. Michael's conference room, it carried like a rifle shot across a valley. Viper 6. He said her call sign. The one only her unit knew. The one that had been classified for 7 years. The room didn't just go quiet. The room stopped breathing. A Marine Corps colonel had been visiting his grandson 3 floors up. He recognized the silver star through the glass partition and walked in. He didn't ask permission. He stood in front of the shadow box and read the citation aloud, each word a stone being laid down in a foundation nobody could argue with. For conspicuous gallantry under fire in Kandahar province, Captain Sarah Chen repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to extract wounded personnel. He paused. His voice hardened. On 4 separate occasions. Mercer tried to interrupt. Something about dramatic theater and irrelevant, but the colonel was already reaching for the next medal. Bronze Star. Pause. Eyes on Mercer. Silver Star. Longer pause. The weight of metal and ribbon and sacrifice settling into the room like gravity. 2 Purple Hearts. The colonel's hand trembled slightly as he touched the Navy Cross. And this one. 15 soldiers came home because of decisions made under fire. 15 families got to have Thanksgivings. Mercer's face had gone from concrete to ash. The glass doors opened again. A 2-star general in dress blues. He'd been touring the veteran wing on the 3rd floor. Someone had radioed him. He walked into the conference room and without a word, he saluted the shadow box. Not a casual acknowledgement. A full military salute, the kind that means something. Every person in that room stood up. Nurses who'd never served, administrators who'd never heard a helicopter rotor, hospital staff who suddenly understood they were in the presence of something that transcended their hierarchy, they all stood. The general turned to Sarah. Captain Chen. He said her rank like it was armor. Your code name Viper 6 is authentic. Confirmed by CENTCOM. Your assignment at this facility was classified at the TSC level. That classification, he glanced at Mercer, supersedes any local institutional authority. Mercer opened his mouth. No sound came out. Then the FBI walked in. 2 agents with badges that caught the fluorescent light. Behind them, a Pentagon liaison with a file folder that was clearly marked restricted. Dr. Marcus Mercer, the lead agent said, and the tone was the tone that changed lives. We've been investigating billing fraud at this facility for 6 months. Your termination of Captain Chen occurred immediately after she filed 17 separate incident reports regarding medication inventory discrepancies and phantom billing codes totaling $843,000. The agent flipped a page. You then attempted to forge her personnel file to create grounds for disciplinary action. That's document falsification with federal employment records. That's interference with an ongoing investigation. Mercer's hand started shaking. You're under arrest, the second agent said, and the handcuffs clicked. Not roughly, but audibly. The sound traveled through the hospital like a bell toll. As they led him out, his face had transformed. The arrogance had evaporated. What remained was the collapse of someone who had miscalculated the depth of the person he was trying to destroy. The news cameras were already outside, and they captured every frame, the walk of shame, the hand on his elbow, the way he flinched when a nurse he'd humiliated looked at him without expression. Sarah didn't watch him leave. She was looking at Captain Wheeler. His hand was extended, and he was pressing something into her palm. The folded flag. The one she'd carried from Kandahar 14 months ago. The one that had pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat while she folded scrubs in the hospital laundry room. Your son, Wheeler said, his voice still a whisper but anchored now, is the finest soldier in my unit. Just like his mother. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the VA hospital at the orthopedics ward. The walls had changed. The protocols had shifted. St. Michael's had announced a formal veteran care division, and the hospital board had offered her the position of chief of trauma. She'd declined. Instead, she'd taken a night shift at this facility, Denver VA Medical Center, where soldiers came to heal and nobody asked if she was just a nurse. David was home on leave. He'd made it through his first deployment without a scratch, which meant he'd learned from watching her that some scars don't show on skin. Captain Wheeler had recommended him for Ranger School, and David had broken the course record for rappel descent. At the vending machine on the second floor, Sarah pushed the button for black coffee. No sugar. Her hands had learned long ago that trembling was a liability. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the body's way of holding back what it could do if it needed to. A young nurse, maybe 2 years out of training, recognized her from the news coverage. "You really saved that soldier?" During an active code. Sarah didn't look up from her coffee. Field conditions. Improvisation. Nothing special. My training instructor said you used a combat knife. The nurse's eyes were wide. Sarah finally turned. Her voice was quiet. Scars tell stories. Some of them are just harder to read. She stepped into the elevator, and the nurse watched her go, understanding in that moment that she was looking at someone who'd been forged in a different kind of fire. The hospital had changed too. The billing department had 3 new auditors and a compliance officer who actually cared. Dr. Mercer was teaching CPR classes at a community college in Boulder for minimum wage, and every time a student called him doctor, he flinched. His medical license had been suspended pending the federal trial. The investigation had unraveled 18 months of fraudulent billing, pharmaceutical kickbacks, inflated trauma codes, insurance claims that had never existed. Sarah moved through the VA wards with the same quiet efficiency she'd always carried. But now when a patient crashed, the residents didn't wait for orders. They watched her. The voice that had once whispered in a laundry room now commanded operating rooms. Push 1 milligram epi. 14 gauge line. Get me a trauma cart. Her hand steady. Her mind clearer than it had ever been. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who were forged in fire and chose to heal instead of fight. And tell us, would you have walked away from that operating room when they told you to stay away from the patient? Or would you have come back?